So I think we'll get started. I don't know who we might still be expecting, but I'm going to share my screen. And tonight's topic is prayer choreography and a couple other things that I was asked about.
I wondered if that was Miriam's dance choreography.
I hadn't thought of that, but I guess you could say that's part of prayer choreography too. I didn't think of it in quite that way.
That's clever.
Yes. But I do have something a little related to that here. uh, I've never seen anyone doing Spanish flamenco dance at temple, but maybe it has happened. Or it could still happen. So my sort of subtitle for this topic is "We never did that where I grew up," which is my own reaction and many other people's reactions. Especially if you grew up in classical Reform Judaism, it's like, what is all this moving around and hand motions? And we never did that. So I thought I would talk about that a little bit tonight. So first, I'd like you to name some things that you've noticed. I'm going to get out of this large screen so I can type on. Come on. How do I want to go away? Hold on. I want to get smaller here. Why can't I get smaller? Oh, here comes Michelle. Oh, that's why. Here it is, but I have to. There we go. Hi, Michelle. Glad you're here tonight. So I want to have you throw out some things that you notice. What kinds of prayer choreography, or we might say physical actions in prayer, do you see? I've started us out. You might see people bending. You might see people bowing. What else do you see?
Swaying, either back and forth or side to side.
Okay, swaying. What else?
Going up on your toes.
Okay, up on toes. What else?
Stepping back and then stepping forward.
Okay.
A couple of times.
Steps back and forward. What else?
Ben, you're conservative. You knew what that was.
But I don't know why we do that.
People from any tradition can throw things out. Yeah.
Covering your eyes.
Covering eyes. Okay.
When I was, I went to a service, a Rosh Hashanah service, with my sister at a Reform temple, and no, it wasn't Rosh Hashanah. I'm sorry, it was just a Shabbat service, and they did the Hakafah with the Torah, and people were touching the Torah with their talit or whatever, or their prayer book, and then kissing it. And she looked at me and she said, "That's an Orthodox thing. We never did that when we were growing up. That's Orthodox."
Okay. What else?
Yom Kippur.
Go ahead, Linda.
Yom Kippur, at some point when we had another more conservative or Orthodox rabbi, he laid down, was prone and
prostrating oneself.
Yes.
Not to be confused with, I think I wrote prorating.
And beating your breast
Yeah.
at the song.
Yep.
That's what I was going to say.
Oh, sorry.
There's also facing east, turning and facing east.
Great. Oops, that was not supposed to be that. It's supposed to be an 8. You guys are coming up with a lot. What else?
Hand motion when you light candles.
Oh, yeah.
Covering.
Right, and covering your eyes, but yeah, doing that and covering the eyes.
Anything else? Well, that's a pretty good list. Anyone got another one?
Well, at my grandson's school, and they were having a Kabbalat Shabbat for the kids, and they all, at a certain point, I forget when exactly, but then they all made this hand gesture, if you can see.
Let's see you again. I lost you somehow. Show it again. Talk and show it so you show up.
Okay, wait a second.
Talking at your grandson's school. Keep talking.
Yeah. Oh, I was at my grandson's school and they had a Kabbalat Shabbat, and at some point all the kids put their arms forward and, you know, separated their pinky and ring finger and separated it with their middle finger. And
Oh, yes. The Spock thing, right? The thing that Spock does when what does he say? Live long and prosper.
I don't know.
Like Ben's got,
It's actually is that what it is? What Linda's showing? Priestly benediction hands. I'll come back to that.
I want to see. Do it again, Linda. I want to
This,
see.
right? Is that what you're talking about, Harriet?
I don't know, just a second, I've kind of lost my picture. Okay. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Okay. Was there something else?
With my arthritic hands.
Yeah, it's not, first of all, not everyone can do it, but especially if you have arthritis, it's even harder. Okay, well, I think that's a great list. We're going to go on from here. And you should be in the bigger mode now, and maybe you can see the things I typed better. You seeing that all right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Okay. So I'm going to start with something that no one has mentioned, but maybe it's just so obvious, which is, and I don't have a slide for this, so I'm just going to stop the share. Standing.
Mm.
You know, there's a lot of standing and sitting, and you know, if you aren't in the know where to stand and where to sit, and it can be very different from congregation to congregation when people stand and when they sit. There are some prayers for which we always stand, but there are definitely differences from community to community. So this may surprise you, but not all communities stand for the Shema or the Kaddish.
Really? I don't know about the Kaddish.
Well, in traditional congregations, who stands for the Kaddish?
Mourners.
Only the mourners,
Like,
right?
only mourners, not everybody.
Right. And I think that was an innovation of the Reform movement, that everybody stands for the Kaddish and sort of in solidarity with those who mourn, and also perhaps as a result of the Holocaust, and just, you know, everybody stands because there are so many for whom they have no one to say Kaddish. But in all the other movements, it's only the mourners who stand for the Kaddish. And if you're in a service where the reader's Kaddish or the Chatzi Kaddish is done several times, and we'll talk about this more, and we'll get to the parts of the prayer night that we're going to do, parts of the service night. But maybe you've been in an Orthodox congregation or a Shiva minyan where the mourners stood up multiple times during the service. Every time the Kaddish is said, they stand up. So that's one that is not universal. And also the Shema. Probably if you grew up in a Reformed congregation, everybody stood for the Shema because of the significance of the Shema. But actually, most traditional congregations say the Shema seated. And the one part of the service that everyone does stand up for is the Tephila, or the Amidah section of the service. We call it Tephila in our prayer book. It's that long section in the middle of the service where we do the Avot Imahot and Giburot. You know, we chant the first part, and then There are several other prayers, depending on if it's weekday or in the middle of the or a Shabbat, it's longer or shorter. Many congregations, another name for that service, and it's often colloquially called Amidah, which means standing. So that part of the service, at least part of it, is done universally standing. In many Reformed congregations like ours, we sit down after the first 3 prayers and do the rest sitting. But in a traditional congregation, you would stand for the entire thing. Another part of the service where everybody stands would be what? No matter where you are? For Aleinu, good. At the end of the service where we face east and open the ark. And
when you take the Torah out.
Right. Whenever the Torah is moving around or being handled other than on the table being read, is everybody stands out of respect for the Torah, right? Mm-hmm. So, you know, in and of itself, standing is interesting because there are so many different traditions and customs. Some of them have to do with Orthodox versus Reform. Some of them just have to, even from Reform congregation to Reform congregation, it can be different. Some congregations rise for the call to worship, the Baruch Hu, which is always done standing, but then they sit down for the rest of that part of the service, so they're sitting during the Shema. We stand up for Baruch Hu and stay standing until the Shema is done. Some congregations, actually the Shema is not just that one line, it's also the Ve'ahavta. So some people say, why are you sitting down in the middle of the Shema? You should stand for the whole thing. But that's sort of a typical Reform, a thing that's done that way in the Reform movement. And so, you know, when the kids go to camp and different people from different congregations lead services, they'll see all sorts of different versions because it's just done differently in different places. So any comments on standing? You know, the idea is standing before God, you know, so you rise to these parts of the service to stand before God. Comments on that?
Yeah, I have one, Dina. When we were kids in my parents' congregation, whenever they had a Yizkor service and our parents were still alive, we were required to leave.
Right.
Still,
So was I.
So it's, I guess that's part of standing. You had to stand up and leave. It's because there was a superstition that if you say Kaddish, if you go to a Yizkor service, it's your parents are going to die. It's only for people who have had a death of next of kin. So children shouldn't be there. Or maybe some parents thought it was too sad for children and they should leave the room. But I think for a lot of people it was that superstitious, you know, get the children out of here.
Superstition. Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember growing up when I was really little, we always stood for the Shema, and then when our rabbi left and we got a new rabbi who was much more traditional and we sat down for the Shema, I could never figure that out because to me, if you're more religious, why wouldn't you stand?
I know.
It never made sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, that's like the declaration of faith. Why would we sit when we say that, but stand when we say other things? But it's not traditionally required. Yeah.
Yeah, but in my mind, some temple or synagogue that I belong to, that they said, whatever you're doing right before the Shema is what you do during the Shema. So if you were already standing, you stand, and if you were sitting, then you continue to sit.
I've heard that too.
That's what I heard.
But I don't quite get that either.
Okay.
Right. I heard that too, that if you stand for the Baruch Hu and you stay standing, then you continue for the Shema. I heard that too.
Yeah, I also have heard that. All right, let's, move on to bending and bowing. So I do have a slide for this one. Let me get that up here. Does that look Jewish to you? Especially with the
only during Aleinu and Rosh Hashanah.
Okay,
big
well,
Aleinu.
this is what I'm getting at, and what somebody mentioned about one time we had we actually was a Reform cantor, but Reform movement cantor, but he came out of a more traditional background. That was before Orit. We had Cantor Cole,
Yeah.
Menachem Cole, and he did this during Rosh Hashanah services, Aleinu, and I think people's jaws dropped. They had never seen that before. They never knew that as anything having to do with Judaism. But if you read in the Bible, in Daniel, the book of Daniel, chapter 6, verse 11, it says that Daniel kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day. And the understanding of how ancient Jews kneeled was that they prostrated themselves like this, full prostration. But that by the rabbinic period, it was changed to bending your knees and bowing your upper body. But this bowing, prostrating oneself like this is still done, as was mentioned, in Ashkenazic, Eastern European or European descent Jews have this tradition, only on Rosh Hashanah, and only at the Aleinu Hagadol, the great special Aleinu that we do just before the first sounding of the shofar. So it is still done, but not in all congregations, and only at that one time a year.
When I grew up, it was done on Rosh Hashanah.
It was.
That startled. When I grew up on Rosh Hashanah, it was done in my Orthodox show, and it startled me. I thought he fell down.
Okay. I thought you were going to say it startled you that when you went Reform, they didn't do it.
Well, I didn't think much about it. I started Reform in Karen's father's show, and I was much happier there. So
I also remember there were 2 people that would be up there with the cantor, because when they went down, something about their feet were supposed to stay where they were, and they would lift him back up so he didn't move, something like that.
Wow, I don't know anything about that piece.
It was the coolest thing to see.
I think some people in our congregation were worried that something happened to this cantor who did it,
Keep her down.
Does anyone remember that?
I do. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely do.
Yeah, he told me he wanted to do it, and I said, well, you need to explain it if you're going to do it. And I think he did, but I still think people weren't quite ready for it. So in the Talmud, it's stated that in reciting the Tephila, which again is that standing part of the service, or Amidah, one should bow down at the appropriate places until all the vertebrae in the spinal column are loosened. So that sounds like a much different movement than this, right? They wanted you to bend over. I mean, if you do, cat and cow and yoga, it's that stretching out of all the vertebrae, right? And the prayers you do it on are prayers of blessing that have the word Baruch. And there are a lot of prayers that have Baruch in them, right? You actually don't do it in every prayer that has Baruch, but you do it in the Baruchu, which is, Baruchu et Adonai Hamvarach, Baruch Adonai Hamvarach Leolam Va'ed. The root of the word Baruch, which is also blessed or praised, actually is also the same root for knee, like the part of your body, the knee. So there is a connection between the bending the knee and blessing. So the times when it's traditional to bend and bow are in the Baruchu, which you probably notice people doing, and in the first 2 and the last 2 blessings of the Tephila. So the Avot Imahot, Gevurot, the one about our ancestors, the one about God's powers, and then at the end, the one about Thanksgiving, Modi Menachnu Lach, and Sim Shalom, or Shalom Rav. I don't see too many people in our congregation bowing for all of them, but sometimes I see them bowing for the first couple and for Baruch Hu. And again, growing up, nobody bent or bowed ever in my Reformed congregation growing up.
Mine either.
Yeah.
And Dina, where again did you say that about bowing so that you're about the vertebrae? Where was that?
In the Talmud, it says, in reciting the Tephila or the Amidah, one should bow down at appropriate places until all the vertebrae in the spinal column are loosened.
So it's not out of respect?
Oh, it is. It is. It's bending and bowing to God. But it was changed from what this guy is doing in the picture to just bending the knee and bowing. And you bend on the word Baruch, and you come up for Adonai, because you're not supposed to, have your head bowed on the word Adonai. And of course, we also bend and bow at Aleinu.
I was just going to say that.
But Aleinu is special because in Aleinu you are actually saying in the Ba'anachnu korim umishtachavim umodim, you're singing, and we bend, and actually umishtachavim is we prostrate ourselves. So it's we bend the knee and prostrate ourselves before God is what you're really saying. And so there's even a more pronounced bending and bowing there in Aleinu than in the Baruch, prayers that have Baruch in them. Okay, so
I remember I used to do, bend on Achnu and then, or the knees, and then bow Korim. But then I learned, I think Ari learned it at Kutz camp, was on the second word, Achnu Korim is when you bend the knee, and then the third one is when you bend.
Right, Korim also means to bend the knee.
Yeah, okay.
So you're saying, and we bend the knee, and then you bend.
Right.
And prostrate ourselves, and then you come up.
They started with the second word, not the first word of that line.
Yep.
Why wouldn't you be bending at the word Adonai? Why? I don't know.
We want to stand up and face Adonai, I guess. You want to stand up and face God. You're showing, out of respect, you bend, but then you face God.
Oh, okay.
Show your face to God, if you will.
When we have the Torah out, when we do God Lu Adonai, don't we stay bowed during that whole, or not necessarily?
Lu Adonai. I think, yeah. I'm not sure about the choreography of that, like the exact words you're supposed to bend and bow on, but you're supposed to turn and face the ark and bow during that prayer.
Okay.
And a lot of this, and like I said, I did not grow up with this. So this is stuff I've just picked up along the way. And I think when I first came to Beth Hillel, I don't think I was doing any of it except for maybe at Aleinu. But then the kids were coming back from camp doing all this bopping up and down and bowing and bending. And I thought, I need to model at least the correct way to do it for the parts that I know. Because there's all sorts of strange, I'm not talking about the hand motions for the songs, but, they come back with stuff that I've never heard of before. They're bouncing around and doing stuff. So I started to do it, and the vast majority of my colleagues, rabbis, do this, and a lot of them also, by the way, face the ark. Esther mentioned facing east. I did not learn in rabbinical school to lead services by turning around, but most of for the Amidah and other parts of the service, the Baruch Hu, most of my colleagues that are younger than me, they all turn around and face the ark, and they do at camp too. The song leaders turn around. So you probably have seen Orit turn around, and I'm not turning around. And part of it, until I had my headset, was I didn't have a mic if I turned around.
Right.
Now I do. But so these are things too that I just found my way into. It wasn't something I was raised with or knew naturally. I'm going to move on to shuckling and swaying. Ben mentioned this. This might be more familiar if you've seen or raised in or have seen Orthodox prayer, but I want to show you this little video. This is called Thousands of Children davening, and that's a word we should share too. Davening is the Yiddish for praying, but it implies the sort of swaying and rocking that goes on, and some shuckling, sort of, moving your feet a little in Orthodox prayer. So I just thought I found this sort of interesting. Do you see it now?
Yeah.
Just look at all the kids.
Why do they pull the talit over their head?
Just a way of, having kavanah or sincere intention or devotion in your prayer. I would, especially if you think if there's 1,000 boys in the room, you might need that. But do you see what I mean about the moving like this? And it's not just in this setting. I mean, did anyone grow up in a setting where that was sort of, you would see maybe not exclusively men, but especially men doing that?
Yes.
Yeah, and I
saw it in Israel, in like at the hotel, and was it Wilson's Arch, where they were studying. Yeah, we went to a yeshiva, and the boys were there when they were at the desk as they were reading. They were going back and forth.
And they say it improves your kavanah. It improves your devotion and prayer. That's people who are raised in this. It's just a style of praying, but also that it's a way to I suppose in the same way that people use a mantra to get into their meditation, or even in some ways, the stuff the kids make up with the hand motions for their songs at camp, it's a way to like express yourself beyond just the words, with what you're saying and what you're doing. So I notice when I see myself on, now I see myself on video in services, and I notice that I move back and forth a lot like this when I'm leading services, and I didn't even realize I was doing it,
So the swaying isn't a part of a particular part of the service.
No, it's a style of, getting into your prayer and really praying with sincerity, or studying, as Ben mentioned.
Well, in the Orthodox temple that my parents belonged to, there was communal prayer, but there wasn't anybody leading the prayer, so to speak. I mean, they were all going at different paces, and
and that's typical of Orthodox prayer.
Yeah.
That you, I think I have to go back. That you don't. There's no one who's like directing that we all do this in unison. You do it at your own pace. I mean, you're sort of in the same part of the service, but there's no need to do it in unison. And it probably seems really disorganized to someone who especially came from a Reform service where, it's very clear, like responsive reading, and now we'll listen to the choir, and it's all very choreographed, and it's, in some, depending on your congregation, very performative. The congregation kind of sat there and watched the service and didn't participate all that much until, in earlier versions of Reform worship.
That's how Beth Hillel was when I first came into it, and I was really uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Seemed weird to you.
Yep.
Yeah.
First Reformed temple I went to was like that, and then we went back. It was a cousin Susie's, the kids' bar and bat mitzvahs, and then they had a different rabbi, and then it was much more participatory versus a performance. And then I'm like, okay, I could do this, once it became where it was a participation.
Yeah. Is that a hand up, Dick?
Oh, I have my finger over the camera.
Oh, okay. Anyone else have a comment before I go on to other examples?
I have a relative who was raised Orthodox, and he said that when he goes to our Reform service, especially where if they're playing the guitar and everybody's singing, he said it's not like davening. It's like it doesn't seem like davening to me. And I think I thought it was just because people weren't moving and people weren't going at their own pace. I thought that's what he meant. And also he objected to music and guitars and stuff.
Yeah, and actually, Michelle, I'm glad you're here tonight because you brought up the music. Why do they keep changing the tunes and stuff? I want to try to get to that at the end because it's relevant to what Harriet just said too.
So
going up, go ahead. What?
I was going to say it didn't seem sincere or like real praying. It was just.
It wasn't what he's used to, and what real praying is what you're used to, right?
Yeah, that's what I tried to explain, but it fell on deaf ears.
Anyone else before we go on? Okay, so tippy toes. So who knows what prayer we do that in?
Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh.
Right, the Kedusha. And it's the part of the prayer where we go Kadosh, 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 and it means holy, holy, holy. So I don't know if you've ever noticed, but in the footnote of Mishkan Tephila, it explains that this is a quotation from the prophet Isaiah and his vision of God. When Isaiah is called by God, he has this elaborate vision and he sees angels, he sees God's throne, and he sees angels calling back and forth to each other, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. And so going up on the tippy toes is like us trying to, reach that level that the angels were called back and forth to God. So, again, no one ever went up on their toes in the congregation I grew up on. I don't know when I learned to do that, but that's very, very commonly done in all kinds of congregations. This one nobody mentioned, but have you ever been in a congregation where the Torah was lifted and we sing the Zotat Torah?
Yes.
People went like
Yes.
this?
Yep, I do that.
Absolutely.
And they're pointing at the Torah, right?
Yeah.
So, does anyone know what we're saying when we sing Zotat Torah Asher? So we're singing, this is the Torah. Right. This is the Torah that God gave to Moses before the children of Israel. So they're saying this is the Torah. Now, how it got to be that finger, we really don't know where this came from. And you can go online to Orthodox places, websites, and they'll discuss it. And they'll say, there's no law about this. It's just a custom. You don't have to do it, but people like to do it. So if you ever see it, that's what that is.
I heard it's like you're not supposed to point. So you're by with your pinky, it's a way of pointing without directly pointing. That's what I heard.
And do you know why you're not supposed to point?
No, eye.
I don't.
What did you say, Harriet?
Is it something to do with the evil eye?
Kind of, yes. So it's not, this is pointing at a Torah, but you're not supposed to point at people and count people. This is a Jewish superstition because the angel of death, it'll be easy for them to find them.
Really?
Yeah. So I don't think that has to do with the Torah one, but I guess you could accidentally point at the person holding the Torah maybe. Hitting the chest. So again, this is something very new to Beth Hillel. Maybe only since Orit came and she did it, or I don't know, more traditional people coming to our synagogue and doing it. But it's like, little punishing yourself a little bit for all the sins, right? Because it's during the recitation of the sins. Everyone, you give yourself a little hit on the chest. So that's what that one's about. No one mentioned, I don't think, turning around and facing the entrance of the room at Lachad Odi. There's other turning around facing east, the direction of Jerusalem and the direction of Jewish prayer, but this time we turn toward the entrance of the room to welcome the Shabbat bride into our midst. And again, we sang Lachad Odi every Friday when I grew up, but we never turned around and faced the entrance of the room. But it's a beautiful custom, and you can go anywhere in the world, for Kabbalat Shabbat, and you'll see that people do that. They turn around and face the entrance of the room for Lachad Odi. The backward and forward steps. Some people do this at the beginning and at the end of the Amidah or the Tephila section of the service, and I think some people do it at the end of the Kaddish.
Right,
And
yeah.
it's the symbolism is that you're approaching and leaving God. So at the beginning of the Amidah, you're take 3 steps back and then forward because you're approaching God. And then at the end, you do the reverse. You start forward and go back because you're going back to the place of the profane, leaving the realm of the sacred.
Do we do that?
I don't do that, but I do see some congregants doing it.
Oh,
Has anyone noticed anyone doing that in our congregation?
I do it at the Kaddish.
try
I
to
think
do-
you do it at the Kaddish, Ben, right?
Yeah, I do.
And Oseh Shalom V'Romav.
Right. Yeah, we
And
get
there's,
to
and there's a going like this.
right.
And do you know why? Because I don't know the answer to that.
I really don't, unless it's the same kind of thing, because after the Kaddish, it being a holy prayer, it's the taking the steps back from God and kind of an acknowledgement kind of thing, and then coming forward. I
Maybe so.
think
Maybe
that's
it is
why
the
my
same.
father used to do that, and that's where I picked it up.
By the way, some people in Lachat Odi also bend at 2 points because you're saying,
Right. But we collab.
you're saying, come, O bride, and it's like, you're bowing out of respect to the bride as she's coming. So you'll see people do that too. Okay, I gotta see what time it is.
I have one question.
Yeah.
I can't remember. It's bothering me which prayer it is that you turn to the left and you turn to the right and then to the center.
Oh, the
What
Kedusha.
That might
That
be
is-
that might be Oseh Shalom at the end of the Kaddish.
Then
Yeah,
is that what you have experienced?
Yeah, that and the Kedusha, both at the Kedusha
Yeah.
of Karazal, Elzah.
Oh yeah, Zeh El Zeh. That's right. That's another place because we're saying
why
at
do we
that
do that?
part you're saying, and the angels called this one to that one, and then
Oh.
it's Kadosh Kadosh. Zeh El Zeh is this to this. That's
Why we do it.
image.
Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you.
I do it, but I never knew why. That's what I want to know is why we do these things.
I don't always, we don't always know why we're doing that.
Right, right.
Sometimes we do.
My kids will go up on their toes during Tephila when they mention the matriarchs and the
I
patriarchs.
know.
Like,
They learned that at camp.
Right.
I've heard explanations of why, but I didn't find that in anything I read for tonight that that's something you're supposed to do. But the explanation is that each of the patriarchs and matriarchs had their own understanding of God, which is why we say Elohei before each one. Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Leah. Instead of just saying God of these 7 people and list them all, you say God of every time, because they each had their own unique relationship and understanding of God. And that's why I think some people are teaching that you stand up on your toes for each one.
Okay.
But I don't know where that comes from.
Hmm.
Really. I mean, in tradition, I don't know where it comes from. I want to go on to the tunes that Michelle asked about and get back to my slides here. No, that's not my slides. That's the people. Chuckling and swaying. So, Michelle asked, why do you keep changing the melodies? I like the same old melodies. So the thing is, there were never any set melodies in Jewish tradition. There are some melodies that we have the tradition that they are mi-Sinai, that they came from Sinai, like they're so old that no one knows anymore who composed them or when they were first sung, and so we say they're from Sinai. And the Shema is one of those. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu. Another one is I think they say that about Kol Nidre, but I think we have some idea of when that melody came to pass. There are a few others, that they say they're Sinai, but in truth, there probably isn't anything like that. They all were composed at one time, but we just lost track of who wrote it, if we ever knew. In addition, there's something called nusach, and nusach is a pattern of melody that is used in a certain setting or in a certain service. So there's different nusach in different ethnic communities within Judaism. So, most American Jews are descended from Ashkenazic Jews from Eastern Europe or Western Europe, and they had certain kinds of melodies that were in, kind of familiar styles for prayer. But even within the different communities, in Europe, they weren't exactly the same. They may have been similar, but not the same. The same thing, by the way, is true of Torah trope. Every community had its own unique kind of Torah trope. And then if you get between Ashkenazic and Sephardic, or the Mediterranean or Spanish Jews, Jews from the Middle East, their melodies are very, very different. And so that we say they have their own nusach. Plus, the nusach changes depending on whether it's an evening service or a morning service, or a festival service, or a Shabbat service, or a weekday service versus a Shabbat service, or high holidays. You may have noticed when you come in the high holidays, all the melodies are different. It has its own completely unique nusach, and the ones that Orit knew in Israel were very different than the ones that are sung in America. So there is no traditional melody of any of these things, except for, maybe the Shema and these other Sinai melodies. So there is a weekday nusach for example, Avot Imahot. I know it when I hear it. When I'm in a weekday service, I can sing along. But I made a decision a long time ago when we had weekday services not to use it, either to teach it to the kids or like at Shiva, because people don't know it. They only know the one we do on Shabbat. If we had weekday services, it would be different, if we had them all the time. But the kids come back from camp now and they know the weekday nusach versus the Shabbat nusach. I don't know if they know why there's a difference, but they're learning it. But I'm still just teaching one. It's enough for most of them to learn the one they need to know it for their bar mitzvah. So we're doing the Shabbat melody all the time. So you have this thing that there never was any set melody to anything. On the other hand, many of us grew up with melodies, especially in classical Reform Judaism, that were very grand Germanic melodies that came from great liturgical musicians in Europe. Like I brought a picture of Solomon Sulzer here. And there are other names like Lewandowski and Ephros and to us, these great European liturgical composers from the 19th century became like our Reform nusach. So something like so we still use some of them, like when we return the Torah to the Ark. Hodo al eretz v'shamayim. I think that's Sulzer. Ki mitzion, in the whole Torah service. Ki mitzion tetzei Torah. I think a lot of that is Sulzer. The Kedusha that probably many of you grew up with, not the one we sing now, was Lewandowski. And then there were those are the 19th century German or Austrian composers. Then there was an American, at least one very strong American composer that was sort of the classical, sort of set the tone for classical reform, and that was Janowski. Especially in the Midwest, because he was a KAM Isaiah Israel congregation in Chicago. Max Janowski composed a whole High Holy Day service that for many of us who grew up in Reform Judaism, that was the nusach of the high holidays for us. And the main one that remains is Avinu Malkeinu. Avinu Malkeinu, Avinu Malkeinu. That's Max Janowski. When Orit started to meet with me about the high holidays, she had never heard that in her life. And she said, oh, but we don't do that in Israel. We do this. You should do this. I'm like, Orit, it's not high holidays for the people in my congregation if we don't sing Avinu Malkeinu. And, you know, we only now sing it in the evening service. We do a more traditional version in the morning, but, you know, so this is what, you know, a lot of us grew up with and was our, you know, for us, that was the nusach of Reformed Judaism. But then along comes Debbie Friedman and Jeff Klepper and the guitar playing folk singer type kids at camp who started making up melodies that they liked a lot better to prayers. And at first it was completely shut down by congregational rabbis. They refused, they called it camp music. They refused to use it. It wasn't considered elevated enough or really even appropriately composed. It was very casual. And there was a big, you know, to-do about that. Cantorial, you know, schools refused to teach it. And then these people grew up and became cantors, and it completely transformed, for sure, Reform Jewish worship, made it more participatory, made it more accessible. And even some of the more traditional movements will use, like Debbie Friedman's Misha Berach and things like that now. So, and also Israel, the rise of the modern state of Israel, and, you know, Israeli speaking Hebrew every day, and some of the, you know, even like we know that there was an Adon Olam that won the Eurovision Song Contest in 1970 something or other. They, you know, they popularized prayers by putting them to contemporary or folk or pop music, if you will. So when you asked your question, Michelle, I don't know if you were asking like, why can't you just sing one melody every week? Why do you keep changing it from week to week? Or were you thinking more about this?
I just felt like, you know, growing up at Bethel Temple, we always sang the same melodies. Like, I didn't remember them changing until, I guess, I don't know, I guess after you came, maybe. Yeah, I always saying, like, when I hear Adon Olam, I think of Mrs. Daniels singing Adon Olam.
And is the one you think of Adon Olam Asher Malav? Is it that one?
Yep.
Yeah, and that's the Germanic, you know, that probably was a German drinking song that was adopted or adapted for Adon Olam.
Yeah.
You know,
I never really liked it, but
yeah, and I
know.
do use it, you know, but I think most, you know, younger Jews just have never even heard of it because it's so old world and old fashioned, and there are a lot of beautiful Adon Olams. But some of the things I think are probably still the same. Like you were probably already doing Shalom Rav when you grew up here, right, Michelle?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a few that are still hanging on, but that was a camp. That was Jeff Klepper.
I love that song. That's where I think I remember it from learning it, was going to camp.
Yeah, and so that was some of the camp music that was already making its way into Beth Hillel. Not on the weeks ever read him a question was there with the organ, but on the other weeks when you had some kind of guitar playing soloist, right? Or maybe in the weeks when neither of them was there and the rabbi was leading the music, that was probably a lot easier to lead than some of the stuff that the organist in Everetta did.
I remember hating the organ.
Yeah, that's interesting, because see, a lot of people that grew up with it loved it, but it was.
I'm with you, Michelle. That was almost.
That was horrible.
From Bethel.
Some people miss it, you know. They're horrified that we got rid of our organ. Not many.
I just felt like it seemed like a church or something. I don't know. It never seemed to fit.
Interesting.
That's the way it feels to me.
What did you say, Ben?
I said that's the way it feels to me, but I love the music. We never had, I mean, we had singing, but we never had instrumentation, you know, and conservative. And then when Rabbi Harari came, and we were introduced to this incredible world of music, and I'm like, wow, services can actually be joyful and and really, you know, you can get into, like you talk about a mantra, you like really getting into it, and I fell in love with it. I absolutely fell in love with the Reform music.
Yeah,
I agree with Ben.
yeah. So, you know, some people can make the leap and others can't, apparently. Yeah. So, and the other thing I thought maybe what Michelle was getting at was I don't even sing the same version from week to week, you know,
Yeah.
and I like to mix it up and have, you know, a whole lot of different kinds of music. And of course, I have limited repertoire, but you know, I think it keeps it interesting not to do the same thing every week over and over again. Maybe others feel differently. I don't know. We have such a plethora of, you know, different types of music and access to so many things now. It seems a shame to not, you know, use a lot of different ones.
Especially like with
but I think it's
when you have all these different, you know, tunes, and they're not all Reform. I mean, some of them are Hasidic, and just all the different variances of them, and they're beautiful. They are. It's a different tone.
But I think it's a comfort thing. I mean, I really like the old stuff. That's what I grew up with, and that's what I look forward to. But, you know.
Yeah, it's like comfort food, right?
Right,
That's
exactly.
how I feel too, I think. And I remember when I go to like my brother's temple and they're singing the wrong tune or one I don't know, you know.
And like, you know, when we were preparing for Bunny's service, she was saying to me, I want the old ones, you know, I want the old this, the old that. I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? And one of hers was Shalom Rav, you know, which is not old. It's probably from 1979 or something.
Really?
I mean, to some of you that might seem old, but you know, so it's what you are used to and what feels like comfort food to you, you know. And Dick has been in choir, so you know, you probably got exposed to lots of different versions of different liturgical pieces.
Absolutely. The 2 3-inch binders that I turned into the temple have about 365 songs in them that we sang in different ways.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And probably 3 or 4 different versions of Micha Mocha or whatever.
Right.
Yeah. And when I was in rabbinical school, we had a director of liturgical music who was writing new stuff all the time. You know, so that every week there was like a new version of this and a new version of that, and we're using some of his music. We're using his Ein Kamocha, Va Elohim Adonai, and Kedusha. The Kedusha that's so ubiquitous everywhere now. Nekadesh et Shimcha Ba'olam. He wrote that while I was at HUC. Right, exactly.
Dina, how about the composer that we chose not to use his music because of?
Yeah, so he was really part of the folk movement, Karlbach.
Yeah.
Right now I'm blanking on his first name. That's interesting.
Shlomo.
Thank you. Shlomo Karlbach. He was he was Hasidic, but he sort of broke from Hasidism and became his own entity. And he went all around to college campuses all over in the 60s and 70s. The first thing I ever did for my youth group, they let the 7th graders go with the youth group kids in BBYO to Beloit College to hear Shlomo Karlbach. He came and he, you know, everybody sat on the floor and, you know, it was very groovy, and he did all of these, you know, with his guitar, singing these Hebrew songs. And so a lot of his music became liturgical music, but unfortunately he was a sexual predator, it turns out, and then it became very hurtful to people to hear his music. So we had a big discussion about this at Beth Hillel, and we decided not to sing his music anymore. And really, there's just a few pieces that we use often. And at our ritual committee meeting recently, they said, we even forgot what they are. You know, people thought they would really miss them, but they've even sort of forgotten about it. So, and you know, you go down that road, and there's some news that came out in recent weeks that there's probably another person's music we shouldn't be using, but we'll have to cross that bridge when we come to it. So we might end up with not a lot of music. I hope that's
Right,
not
new.
Terrible.
I hope that's not true. So Bunny asked me about the Star of David. I think I'll leave it for another night, Bunny, because it's almost 8. So was there anything that you wanted to ask about relating to prayer choreography, if you will, or synagogue music that we didn't get to tonight? Anyone have a last comment or question?
In the very Orthodox shuls, do they sing? I know they don't have guitars or organs or anything like that, but do they sing in unison?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Music?
Well, a lot of it, as I think Esther mentioned, is this disorganized, everybody doing their own thing. But they do have their own music and recordings. And Rabbi Twersky in Milwaukee is very well known for his compositions. And even the Milwaukee Symphony once did a concert with his compositions. And we sing his Matovu. La 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 Matovu Ohalecha Yaakov. That's Rabbi Michal Twersky's Matovu. So they do, but probably not so much in a prayer setting. Maybe at the end they sing something together, but probably at events where they come together for study and prayer and a meal. It's sometimes called a Verbrengen in the Hasidic community, like it's a celebration with lots of food and socializing and listening to the rabbi give a talk, and they sometimes intersperse singing at those kinds of events where they might sing in unison. Anything else?
I would just like to comment that the first time I went to Karen's, the temple in New Jersey, is the first time I ever heard a synagogue with an organ. And it was like I had just been to a church previously with some friends that were not Jewish, and they had an organ. And I said, my God, this is a church. This isn't a synagogue or a temple. It really bothered me for a long time. And the organ died. And there was a big question. Half the congregation wanted to replace it, and half of them said it doesn't belong in our temple. The ones that purchased the new organ won out over the ones that said it didn't belong.
Oh, really?
And some congregants left.
Yeah.
Really?
Few.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. Well, we phased it out at Beth Hillel. By the time I came, it was already kind of phasing out. It just the style changed. There are still congregations that use the organ, especially some of the big, cathedral-like congregations in New York City and other places. And maybe it fits that environment more. And it's not used all the time. I mean, they also use guitar and piano, and some of them have bands. I mean, this was a phenomenon of the 2000s where every congregation had to have its Tephila band. And, they'd get their people together, and Friday night, it'd be like this whole, rockin' Shabbat. And we never had the talent in our congregation to pull that off. But I think that's still going on in a lot of places.
And Shemet, big conservative in Chicago, I think we have once a month, they have a.
Yeah, and the conservative movement was like losing members because everyone was flocking to these rocking Shabbats, and you couldn't do that in conservative Judaism. So what they did was they started to start early, like, an hour before Shabbat.
Right.
And to bring in Shabbat. And so they got in on it too.
Right. I think some have even had that, they would have the music, but like if you play the guitar and you have a string break, you can't fix it because you can't make a knot after Shabbat and those kind of little things. But then I remember hearing, I don't remember who it was, that said music. I mean, the 150th Psalm says, when you have no more words, you use music. And that's how
it
you
lists all the instruments.
Right. It lists everything right
Timbrel
right. So
and string and lyre and cymbals.
Right, and harp right.
But what the Orthodox, the traditional Judaism halakha taught was that was for the temple in Jerusalem. And once the temple was destroyed, that was the only place you could use instruments. In the synagogue, you couldn't do it.
Yes, with the choreography at our temple, it's just what you feel like doing or what you learn to do. I mean,
Me?
we're not saying you should do this. Or
I'm not, yeah, and I'm not telling anyone they should do this. I'm just modeling it, I guess, and people are picking it up.
Mhm.
And you can
Right.
do it or not do it.
yeah.
You know? Yeah, no, I'm not saying this is what you should do. I'm trying to explain what it is that people are doing. If you choose not to do it, that's just fine. I mean, I know there are people that do not bend and bow for Aleinu or for Baruch, and that's just fine.
Right.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
See
Thank
you
you.
next week.
I learned so
Thank
much.
you.
Yes.
Thanks,
Ditto.
guys.
To the newcomers, come back.
Thank you.